There we go. The state of Scotland's flora. So I'd like to follow Kevin's talk with a more in-depth look at the changes in Scotland's flora that the Plant Atlas 2020 project has revealed. And I'll start off with asking the question, what makes Scotland's flora so special? Scotland supports a unique collection of habitats, many of which are nationally and internationally important for conservation. For example, it contains a high proportion of wet heath habitats that's globally restricted to the Atlantic fringe of Europe. Within Britain, Scotland supports 79% of Britain's native flora, and this includes global endemics not found anywhere else in the world, such as the beautiful Scottish primrose. Some of our native plants are present here at the very edge of their global ranges, and this slide shows some of those present at the southern limit of their range. So we have Diapensia, a beautiful rare alpine species, top left, oyster plant, bottom left, coastal species, northern marsh orchid, which might be familiar to many people, a plant of wet meadows, and on the right the Scottish eyebright and the russet sedge, which are species of upland flushes primarily. There would be more Arctic alpine species qualifying to be at the southern edge of their range in Scotland, but for populations in the high mountains in southern Europe. So the figure of 35 species at their absolute southern range is a little misleading. So as Kevin has described, Plant Atlas 2020 set out to map the distribution of all flowering plants and ferns growing in the wild in Britain and Ireland, and measure changes in their distribution over the last 70 years from the first BSBI Atlas publication. In Scotland, this involved over 450 volunteer recorders, collecting well over 3 million records of 2,500 plant species. Given the remote nature of much of Scotland and sometimes challenging terrain and conditions, this was an amazing effort, without which the Plant Atlas project would not have succeeded as it has. So a huge thank you to all people who were involved, and it's fantastic to see Vice County recorders here tonight who were the driving force behind this project. So here are some of the key findings from Plant Atlas 2020 in Scotland. 47% of native plant species have declined since the 1950s. And for ancient introductions or archaeophytes, it's even more, it's 66% of species declining, which is the highest proportion of any country covered by the Atlas. It's sobering stuff. In contrast, nearly 2/3 of recent introductions or neophytes are on the increase. And the number of introduced species here in Scotland is now approaching the number of native species in our Scottish flora. So this graph shows the smoothed trends for each of these groups in Scotland since the 1950s, with native species in the sort of bluey purple showing a steady decline, the neophytes, the new recent introductions showing an increase there in brown, and the archaeophytes, or the ancient introductions, decreasing much more significantly there along the green line. We can also break down the Scottish flora by habitat, where species associated with each of the main habitat types in Scotland have been grouped together to allow the overall trend in relative frequency to be identified. So as you might expect from what I've been saying, the arable species such as corn marigold, here the brown line on the graph, have declined significantly. But for broadleaf woodland in red and linear features such as hedgerows in grey, the trends are much more stable. And this is despite a range of threats to our native woodland, such as increasing grazing pressure. And this perhaps shows that the change in condition of habitats, like our temperate rainforest, aren't always picked up by mapping at 10 kilometre square level. as we've done for Plant Atlas 2020. Coniferous woodland species, there in the green line, have increased in frequency, and this reflects the expansion of commercial forestry since the 1950s. The picture for species associated with bog and montane habitats is one of recent declines, consistent across the species within these habitat groups. Heath plants within heathland, appear to have stabilised after historic declines driven primarily by the loss of lowland heath to agriculture from the 1950s to the 1980s. But you can see here that the variation between different species within heathlands is much greater than for the other habitats shown by the broader purple colour line. So acid grassland and calcareous grassland plants have also suffered consistent declines. These are the two lower lines on the graph. And even widespread and familiar species like heath bedstraw and sheep sorrel are showing strong declines due to habitat loss in the lowland and upland fringes and changes to grazing regimes. Now, in England, a recent study demonstrated that half of all semi-natural grasslands had been lost over the last half century. There's no comparable study for Scotland, but clearly habitat loss has impacted our grassland species, such as the harebell, pictured here, which has undergone moderate to strong long-term declines. Neutral grassland species, as shown by the top line, appear to have suffered to a lesser extent, possibly because fewer species are restricted solely to neutral grassland habitats, and the creation of wildflower meadows may have played a part in this recent stabilisation of trends. So I'm now going to focus in a bit more on some of the interesting species stories that Plant Atlas 2020 has revealed, and also showcase some of the ways that you can explore this data on the online atlas. The two native species here bucking the trend and increasing their ranges into Scotland as a result of climate change are the bee orchid, which Kevin mentioned, and mossy stonecrop, a tiny plant pictured here at the edge of a pavement in central Scotland. So this slide shows the expanding range of bee orchid from 1930 at the left to the present day at the right, and the overall trend for Britain down there in the bottom right. Going through each date class, you can see how its distribution has changed over time, with it finally reaching central Scotland and Kintyre in the last 20 years. Interestingly, it's not just a single plant. The Kintyre population, I believe, has hundreds of flowering spikes. Mossy saxifrage, the same pattern, was restricted to southern and eastern England until 1930, when it appeared in north-east Scotland, and it's undergone a dramatic expansion in the last 20 years as a result of milder winter weather, combined with the accidental transport of seeds and plant fragments on shoes and vehicles. And the trend summary on the right shows the strength of the long and short-term increases for this species. Now, another feature of the online atlas is its change mapping, which allows you to show gains and losses for each species over time. Here are two non-native species, the ones that Kevin looked at, which have greatly expanded their range, as shown by the red triangles on the maps. Each red triangle represents a 10 kilometre square gain in that species range. So New Zealand pygmy-weed on the left, an invasive aquatic, has spread rapidly northwards since the 1970s, has even reached Orkney and Shetland in the last 20 years. Sitka spruce has increased in range the most out of all the plant species assessed by Plant Atlas 2020. It's an important commercial forestry tree, and much of these gains are the result of planting to provide timber for the construction industry. It's well adapted to our damp climates and peaty soils, and so it regenerates freely and also seeds into habitats adjacent to plantations such as heathland and blanket bog. As I've said, 2/3 of Scotland's archaeophytes, ancient introduced species, have also declined, and a really interesting example is the corn marigold, now often encountered in sown wildflower beds in urban areas. It's the big yellow one. It's traditionally an arable wheat species and strongly declined in Scotland, mainly due to arable intensification, and in the west of Scotland, there's loss of small-scale arable cropping associated with the abandonment of crofting. And the distribution map shown here shows how it vanished from most of the Hebrides and western Scotland, with each grey circle representing a 10-kilometre square area where it's not been seen since 1986. Another arable weed here, the red dead nettle, has shown similar strong declines in Scotland, and this is a species that flowers almost all year round and provides a really important food source for pollinators. And it's also a species that's adapted to urban landscapes, and it's a really good example of why blanket weed killing in built-up areas is short-sighted. For nearly half our native plant species, the story is quite depressing. Habitat loss and degradation have impacted the globe flower, causing moderate long-term declines and stronger recent declines. The result of drainage of wet pastures, meadow improvement through fertilising and reseeding, and grazing pressure in the uplands, where globe flower is often restricted to inaccessible ledges. Mountain everlasting, a beautiful white plant and species of unimproved grasslands with low fertility, has declined through habitat loss and also as a result of the increased atmospheric deposition of nitrogen, which benefits its competitors, more robust species. In Scottish uplands, grazing pressure is a threat to some species. Montane willow scrub, consisting of plants such as this woolly willow, is an entire habitat that's under threat from grazing, with populations of the willows becoming fragmented and restricted to ledges. Conservation work by the National Trust of Scotland on Ben Lawers and in the Cairngorms has shown that by fencing or reducing grazing pressure, along with careful boosting of populations by translocation, these scrub species can make a comeback. The beautiful alpine gentian is known in Scotland from just 2 areas in the Central Highlands, but its relationship to grazing is more complex, with high levels of sheep grazing causing high plant mortality, but also opening up the grassland and creating bare patches of soil where the gentian seedlings can establish. So the impacts of climate change can be particularly damaging for our high altitude snowbird specialists, such as snow pearlwort and alpine ladyfern. These species rely on late-lying snow to reduce competition from other plants, and as less snow falls and snow patches melt earlier in the year, they're struggling. Snow pearlwort, shown here, is a very rare snowbed species, with almost the entire British population occurring on Ben Lawers. Assessing this species at 10 kilometre square level suggests it's fairly stable. But this map of Ben Lawers shows the rapid rate of recent population loss, with every blue dot representing a population lost in the last 40 years, and the few remaining green dots representing colonies that are hanging on. So as well as giving us the data to understand the trends of plants in Scotland, Plant Atlas Project has seen some new additions to Scotland's flora, to Scotland's native flora. 3 species new to Britain were discovered in Scotland: the salt marsh sedge, the Nordic moonwort, shown here, and the new monkey flower. Salt marsh sedge hardly ever flowers and had been overlooked until 2004. Nordic moonwort was described as a new species by a genetic study in Canada and subsequently found in Glen Shee by a genetic study in 2017. That's the ski lift behind there, just in case you didn't believe it was in Glen Shee. New monkey flower is another species new to science, and as a result of hybridisation between two introduced monkey flowers which are widely naturalised in Scotland. The intensive fieldwork for Plant Atlas 2020 also changed our understanding of the distribution of some native species in a positive way. A good example of this is the alpine bearberry, a dwarf shrub found in new locations due to more intensive recording in the remote parts of northern Scotland, and as a result the species is now no longer assessed as nationally scarce. So, what next for Scotland's flora? Plant Atlas 2020 is an incredibly powerful tool for policymakers and conservationists as they seek to protect our wild plants, the habitats they live in and the wildlife they support. We need to use it and the data that underpins it to help strengthen protection for our threatened plants by safeguarding the best remaining sites and by managing them effectively. We need to restore our compromised habitats such as peat bogs and native woodlands and ensure that areas of high quality habitat are linked together in the landscape. We need to manage our land, water and soils more sustainably for plants, moving away from unsustainable farming practices and land management that promotes high densities of livestock and deer in the highlands. We need to put plants at the heart of our conservation initiatives, as other wildlife depends on them for food and shelter, and that will ensure overall gains in biodiversity. We need to engage in effective monitoring of plants that can deliver reliable data that answers clear policy and research questions. And finally, we need to reduce plant blindness, where despite their importance to us, plants are often overlooked and undervalued. So I'd like to thank all our members and our supporters in Scotland, without whom Plant Atlas 2020 could not have been undertaken, and especially the Vice County Recorder Network that forms the backbone of the BSBI. I'd like to thank RBGE for their fantastic support of BSBI here in Scotland and for hosting us tonight. And I'd like to thank NatureScot, without whose support we could not carry out this vitally important work for Scotland's flora. Thank you very much.